It's Sunday, 20th October 2024. This is Nation Watch, a production of the People's National Congress Reform. I'm your host, Mervyn Williams. With me today is Mr. Vincent Alexander, AA, Commissioner, Guyana Elections Commission, and we'll be discussing the list and the census. But before we do, there's some important milestones that I invite my guest to speak to before we get into business. Mr. Alexander, welcome, and go right ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, Marvin, and good morning to all the viewers. Today, in fact, yesterday, a venerable member of the People's National Congress Reform and a member of the Pastoral Council of the Burnham Foundation, Pastoral Council of Elders of the Burnham Foundation, celebrated yet another birthday. So I'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of the Burnham Foundation and on my own behalf to wish her the best on this occasion and to wish her another productive birth year.
And I'd like to join you on behalf of the leader, executive, and members of the People's National Congress Reform to do likewise. And there's another.
I would also like to extend greetings, felicitations to the Kitty Methodist Church. You know, that's the church of Lyndon Fobb Sampson Burnham. And they are today celebrating their 154th day of founding. And so felicitations from the Fobb Burnham Foundation, which is in some regards an associate of that church, as we continue to mark to commemorate the life of Lyndon Fobb Sampson Burnham, who benefited in terms of his upbringing from being a member of that church.
Thank you, Mr. Alexander. Very important milestones to recognize and to celebrate. Today we have some very important business to address. But before we get to the actual discussion, for purposes of simplifying this whole issue that sometimes presents a little bit of a difficulty for all of us who are not completely familiar with it. Mr. Alexander, there is the Guyana Elections Commission, and among its functions, their responsibilities having to do with maintenance of a particular list. Help us and our viewers to understand the composition and purpose of these lists. There is the National Register of Registrants. We've heard about a preliminary voters list. We've heard of claims and objections and a revised voters list. And we know that in the public domain now, there's something called an official list of electors. Help us understand these different lists, please.
First of all, I think people should know that GECOM really has two functions. One is the conduct of national registration and the compilation of a list of registrants. And two is the conduct of elections. These are really separate functions.
Mm-hmm.
And for the conduct of those separate functions, the person whom we refer to as the CEO, the Chief Elections Officer, is also appointed as a Commissioner of National Registration.
Mm-hmm.
So he has two functions. This is a collapsing of functions that previously resided in the Ministry of Home Affairs with the establishment of GECOM. So from the standpoint of national registration, what GECOM really does in the first instance is to compile a list of registrants, as we call them, who are all Guyanese resident at the time. Well, that's a little controversial. All Guyanese over the age of 14. So GECOM compiles the list of all the persons who are available to register themselves over the age of 14. In fact, registration once you're in Guyana is really compulsory. There isn't much that's done about that, but it's really a compulsory act. Every Guyanese should be registered once you attain the age of 14. That registration has traditionally been done in two ways. It's important for us to clarify that. There are instances where the registration was done house to house.
Mm-hmm.
And there are other instances where the registration is done office-based. There's really no fundamental difference between the two. Because people tend to say, well, you're going to do house registration. As if we don't do that, we're not doing registration.
Mm-hmm.
But registration can be done house to house, and it can be done office-based. And if I'm not mistaken, the legislation was amended and does not make house to house a compulsory form of registration. So it can be done house to house, and it can be done office-based. Registration is presently being done office-based of all the persons who are not yet on the register over the age 14 and plus. As a consequence of that, the register is compiled, but that register is compiled through a process. It's not just you go and register and that's it. There's a process. At the end of the cycle of registration, because we now have two cycles, we do it twice a year. At the end of the cycle, so to speak, the last phase of the cycle, the list is published of the persons who have been registered, and in fact, a complete list is published. That publication provides for an exercise, and that list is called a preliminary list.
Mm-hmm.
It's called a preliminary list. And it provides for an exercise of claims and objections, meaning that when that preliminary list is published, persons can examine the list to see if by any chance there are persons on the list who are not eligible and put in an objection. So if a dead person names appear in the list, you can go and put an objection, and that objection is heard. And once you can prove by the certificate the person is dead, that person will be taken off of the list. but they can also make claims. So persons who have not been registered during the cycle can make a claim to be included on the list during that period of claims and objections.
And claims can be made on behalf of such persons as well?
No,
Okay.
persons have to make the claims in their own right.
Right.
That period also provides for corrections. If there are errors, you can have the errors corrected, the address, spelling of your name, etc. After that is done, and those claims, objections, and corrections are applied to the list, then a revised list is then issued, a revised list. And that too is the preliminary list is posted up in the community, and so is the revised list. And that list is also subject to examination. And if there are errors, that can also be brought to the attention of GECOM, but there's no specific claims and objection period for the revised list. And I think it's out there for 21 days. And once that 21 days elapse, then GECOM goes back to the system and produces from that a list of electors. Remember, the registration really covers persons over the age of 14. But an output of this process is a list of electors. So it's just persons
Qualified to vote.
who qualify to vote by a specific, by a qualifying date. It's a qualifying date in terms of you have to be 18 by that date.
And this has
qualify.
a relationship with an election date?
Not really.
No.
Not really.
It's cyclical?
We produce the lists twice per year. But you produce the list twice per year, specifying that you are eligible to be on the electoral roll if your birthday is by a certain date. Because you can only be in that roll if you are 18 and over.
By a certain
So
date.
they specify the date by which you qualify based on your becoming of age. And therefore you then go on to the electoral roll. And the final process, as I was saying, is to publish an official list of electors. And that list would normally have a life of 6 months, so that the election can be called at the inception of that cycle or even before. But once that cycle is completed, then we have 6 months, the list is live, and therefore the elections can be held using that list.
Is it 6 or 3? Because I understand that the current one is valid up to December 31st, having been published early in September.
No, it's 6 months as far
6 months.
as I can recall. Let me not put my head in the block, but it's 6 months as far as I can recall the validity
Sure.
of that list. And so while that list is live, we start another cycle of registration. So really what it provides for is for us to have a list ready all the time for elections. And probably I can say something on that 6 months thing you're talking about. The cycle of registration really would last for 3 months in terms of the people going to the office to be registered. But then after that 3 months, we go through this process of the preliminary list, claims and objections, and so forth. And the overall exercise then takes 6 months.
I get
Overall
you.
exercise then takes 6 months.
I get you. So now that there's an official list of electors out there, there is still an ongoing process of what you call continuous
Because it's
registration.
another
ongoing.
cycle of registration. That's another cycle of registration.
All right, so for persons, let's say they're persons living abroad who have an interest in what's happening here. They're abroad temporarily
Or permanently.
or permanently.
Or permanently.
So they have an interest in what's happening here and they want to participate in the electoral process. They do not find their names on this list, but they plan the vacation for Christmas, say, for example. Are such persons in a position to cause their names to be included on this list by registration process?
A Guyanese is in the country at the time of registration, that person is entitled and eligible to be registered.
Good.
The person has to be in the country. We do an office-based registration. The person has to visit the office and to be registered.
Right. So this is a background to how we got where we are and how we proceed with the process over time going forward. Now, is there a nexus between the registration process for electoral purposes and the population census? Are the two at any point in time reconciled for the purposes of accuracy with respect, for example, to the voters' roll?
There's no official process of reconciliation. Bearing in mind that the census would essentially speak to the persons who are in the country at the time of the census. The electoral roll speaks to persons who may not be in the country at a particular time, but were in the country at the time of registration. And in fact, any Guyanese who has been in the country as of 2008 until the present time, during a registration process, could have been registered. So you can have thousands, if not tens of thousands of Guyanese who will not be affected in any way by the census because they're overseas, but their names would be on the electoral roll because they were registered at some time. And our register was established in 2008 and it's been rolling since then. So every Guyanese coming of age as of 2008 has had the opportunity to be registered once he or she is around at the time of registration. And those are every Guyanese over the age of 14.
Right. So
again, one should note the census would not be restricted to an age range. The census covers
persons,
all Guyanese.
Yeah.
But there is
it all Guyanese or all persons present?
All persons present, but it will also specify the Guyanese. But there is, as I said, there's no official reconciliation. But one would have an interest in both of the census and the electoral roll, because the census would give you an idea of a number of things that you can use in your analysis of the electoral roll. For example, the census may give you an idea of the number of children who are at school, you know? And so we've always raised the question that if you have a country where it is claimed that the population is 700 and something thousand, which the census tells you about, and the school population is 200,000, which the census tells you about, then the electoral roll really shouldn't be more than 500,000, you know, in terms of the people who are active. And so immediately from that, you get to know, well, there must be some significant number here that we need to scrutinize. And that number largely would be those who are overseas, and among the overseas, those who are not alive anymore, but are still counted on the electoral roll.
We discussed this before, but I want to bring it back. We have a voters list, an official list of electors. And that list of electors carries 718,715 persons on it, names of 718,715 persons on it as eligible voters.
Yeah.
The last census conducted in Guyana, for which a report was published, was held in 2012.
2012.
And that census tells us that our population at 2012 was 746,955 persons. So if we look at the last available census report and compare to our present official list of electors, there's clearly something wrong there, because we know our population of school children numbers somewhere in the region of 250,000, somewhere around that number. Now, we discussed as well, and you had offered that biometrics at the place of poll is a measure that can help in terms of ensuring that there's no duplication of voting, and as you put it, one vote, one person, one vote. We learned that the Ghana Elections Commission had on its agenda biometrics at the place of poll. How are those conversations coming along, and what are your expectations of the outcome of those conversations?
All right, before we get to those conversations, let me go back to what you mentioned, the census vis-a-vis the electoral roll.
Yeah.
The census focuses on the persons who are resident at the time of the conduct of the census.
Mm-hmm.
So it tells you what the number of people who are actually populating Guyana. The electoral roll tells you potentially of the number of citizens of Guyana, whether they are here or they're not here, so that there's in their names on the electoral roll which would not have been captured by the census, for the simple reason that the census focuses on who are here at the time of the census. And whilst the electoral roll also would provide for registration based on your presence, it is a document that is accumulative. So from 2008 to now, once you were registered, even if you're no longer part of the population, so to speak, which the census seeks to capture, your name is retained on the electoral roll. So, as I was saying, the census provides some information which you can use to do an analysis of the electoral roll that can raise question marks. And the big one that raises the question mark is why, if the people who are present are 700 and something thousand, and your electoral roll and your register of registrants only captures those up to from age 14, how is it your electoral roll is seem to be exceeding your population? And the answer is that, well, all of those people who are not here are on that roll. No, in the preparation of the electoral roll, I mentioned to you that we have a process of claims and objections. But I should also mention that in the preparation of the electoral roll, there is a process where the registrar of deaths and births supplies GECOM in the names of the persons who have died. And those names are then taken off.
Died or registered as having died?
Well, registered as having died. The registrar supplies the names that are in his register as having died. So they are taken off of the list. So that with that happening, and still evidence of a large number of people in excess of those who are actually populating in that age group really represents potentially the persons who are overseas. And we know we have probably as many people overseas as we have in Guyana. But obviously they're not all registered. But the problem with that is that whilst we have a process for the internal deletion of the known dead from the list, there's no process for the deletion of those who die overseas. And those too would be in the tens of thousands, because any Guyanese who got registered between 2008 and now, who's overseas and has died, the name would still be retained on the list. So there's a significant number of names, and that's the only explanation that one can give of the difference that this list covers the overseas, with the problematic being that it covers dead persons who are overseas as well.
I want to interrupt you here before you go to the next part of that question. There's another spanner being tossed into the works here. Cash grant. The numbers that you get from the proposed cash grants, Mr. Alexander, suggest that all is not well in the state of Guyana. The executive president, in speaking to cash grants, said that, and this is before the change, that they were going to disburse cash grants of $200,000 per household to a total of 300 households. The last available census report says that the household size on an average is 3.6 persons. Using his numbers, you're going to see a population of 1,080,000 or somewhere around there. Then a former president, now a second vice president, says that they are 264,000 households, contradicting the head of state. And that will take you to somewhere in the region of 950,000 people, according to households. But when you work it out mathematically from 2012 coming forward, you'll find that there's likely to be more in the region of 240,000 households at 3.6 persons per household, significantly less than the numbers being put out there by the government officials, high government officials. And this is why I asked the question about the relationship between the two, the census and the registration processes, because these numbers either relate to a census report that we have not seen, and if they do, the two high government officials still disagree on those numbers, which can mean that the number is not settled or it's being manipulated. I don't know which it is. But numbers matter. And it's always a case where figures don't lie, liars figure. So something fundamentally is wrong here. A question of whether there's a mental conditioning process that has started to allow people to develop this idea that our population is past 1 million. That's out there. I mean, how does GECOM manage those kinds of expectations in the face of the real numbers?
All right, let me say first of all that you may recall that at some point in time, that vice president said that the census figures are likely to be around 800,000. So he offered a figure prior to all of this mess about households that we're talking about. He offered a figure around 800,000. He's now offered a household figure of 206 or something thousand. And what's of interest is that we have an institution called the Statistical Bureau that's responsible for these numbers. That body has not published these numbers, And the contention is that they haven't published them because they're not completed with the processing. But here's a member of the executive proffering numbers as if he has inside information. And that's the first concern that one will have, that the not only a government official, but a political party seems to be working with some numbers when the other parts of society are uninformed about the numbers. And so a whole range of things can go wrong or can be manipulated using those numbers to the ignorance of the rest of the society. The first point I want to make on this matter. The second point I want to make is that really I think we lack the basis on which to, in our lexicon, use the term household. I don't think that we have in this country defined what a household is, and by virtue of that lack of a definition cannot properly arrive at a figure in terms of a household. And I'm not even sure that our census will help us in that regard because of the definition. What's a household? You know, if one uses a physical definition from the terminology household, then you may want to go to a house and consider that as a whole. Therefore, any house constitutes a household. And so you can count by virtue of the number of houses. But we have in the first instance houses that are occupied by different families and separately occupied, one in the top flat and one in the bottom flat. So that house may have two households.
Even communally occupied in one flat.
I'm coming to that. That house may have two households. And so you hear the confusion about people saying, well, you got to show ownership in order to get this money because it's a household you're dealing with, which would exclude immediately somebody who's the tenant. So then you have to show that you're a tenant, probably. There's a lot of confusion in the definition of a household. That confusion gets greater when you consider the nature of Guyanese families. You may have two families residing in one flat of a house. You have two families. You have a mother with her children, and one of the children may have been married and now has brought a husband, and they have children. And they're essentially two different economies in the house. They're cohabiting in the same place, but their affairs are quite separate in terms of feeding and expenses and things like that. They have separate economies. And so, are they entitled to be considered as a household as well? And so really we have no definitional position, and therefore the term should not feature in things administrative in Guyana, because there is no basis upon which there can be any accuracy, or there can be any proper application in the interest of people of this term called a household. And so it is a source of tremendous not only confusion, but is almost disingenuous to use the term household, and it can lead to disenfranchisement of people. It can also lead to over-enfranchisement. Depends on
how it's manipulated.
Yeah. So really, we should not have any reference to this question of a household, because it is not an objective basis.
That being the way it is, though, Mr. Alexander, it is evident that the term, however it is construed by those in the government hierarchy, is being used to condition the minds of Guyanese that our population is much larger than it is. But let's go, if you will, to the business of the Ghana Elections Commission and its discussions regarding biometrics at the place of poll.
Let me
Take us
close.
there.
I'll get you, but let me just close off to say that the issue is not merely an issue of what could be construed in terms of the size of the population, but the issue is also an issue of what could be construed in terms of the amounts of money is allocated. Because if you allocate 60 million and the households are not indeed 300,000, then all sorts of things could happen with the difference
12 billion.
in the cash.
12
Difference in
billion.
the cash. And I listened carefully to a member of the opposition, an opposition party, Timothy Jonas, on the Globe Fund program. And he pointed to the great possibility of corruption in terms of how that cash is disbursed. Because people can simply go to those who are doing the distribution, and we tend to have a system where these people walk around with
bags of money.
And all you need is a signature, and you can go to an empty lot and because GECOM has found circumstances where people give addresses, and when we go, it's an empty lot. And people say, we don't know anybody in that name who lived here, but that person gave the address. And so in this distribution process, a lot of manipulation can take place surrounding the sums of money available and the overestimation of the number of people involved and the accounting for those monies in relation to a number that has been officially announced.
Yeah, well, that was extensively discussed here on Nation Watch with my guest, Mr. Winston Jordan, former Minister of Finance in the coalition government. He, in that conversation, as he did in an earlier conversation on another program, laid out his version of what the cash grant should look like. And to Mr. Jordan's credit, the government embraced that proposal without acknowledging, of course, its source, and they have shifted to 100,000 per adult Guyanese, meaning from 18 years up. There's now the disagreement on 18 years as of when, with the government saying 1st of January 2024, and Mr. Jordan insisting it should be 31st December 2024 instead, because the payout is going to be in January. So
the question of 18 years and up is which role will you use? Because now, if you're saying 18 years and up, you have to have some reference point in terms of where you get your number of people who are 18 years plus.
There is such a role.
What's that role?
I'm sure the role that emanates from the organization that you serve.
The electoral role.
Yes.
Oh, it is in fact a role that can be used.
That can be used.
But the problem with the electoral rule in that regard is that it captures all citizens who are registered, whether they are resident in Ghana or not. And so there are a significant number of people over the age of 18 who are not resident, for whom we're now making a provision which would either allow for them to come home and collect or allow for misrepresentation of their being and then being collected for.
Well, let's take the conversation to the Ghana Elections Commission and to the biometrics issue, which I'm sure can serve as a tool, an instrument to address these concerns of residency, being present, being eligible to participate by virtue of presence, and so on.
All right. I think that's a very interesting question, extremely interesting, and does in fact pose a scenario that could be useful. But let me start this conversation by saying that we are faced with the situation where the judge gave a ruling that says we cannot take people's names off of the register of registrants and by implication also of the elections rule, unless that person is deceased and goes through that process of claim objections. So that we have an election rule that facilitates the presence of persons as of 2008 who have registered, many of whom are overseas, a great portion of which would have died.
Mhm.
We also have information which has not been challenged, which on the face of the information points out that during the elections, a number of persons who, based on the records kept by the Immigration Department, were out of the country would have been voted for. You know, people are running all around this and not accepting. You have all sorts of arguments that the system has all of these checks and balances.
But the
But the
evidence.
fact of the matter is that there is actual evidence, and therefore it suggests that the checks and balances have not worked, no matter how good they're said to be.
Mhm.
And I need to emphasize that point because there are a lot of people who can best be described as jokers, who are sticking to this argument that you have all the checks and balances, so how did this happen? The fact of the matter is, it's happened. And if
In
it's
spite
happened,
of
in
the
spite
checks and
of the checks and
balances, yeah.
balances, and if it's happened, it has to be addressed. And they are refusing to address it because they're saying they have checks and balances when the problem does exist. Now, the importance of biometrics in the context where we have not resolved the problem of how through the registration process we clean the list is that biometrics does two things. First of all, it provides for digital registration. In other words, digital fingerprints. The digital fingerprints permits us to have almost, I would say, perfect fingerprinting. And perfect fingerprinting means that when we do our checks, our cross-matching after every registration cycle, that's something we also do, we cross-match to see that there are no new registrants who are also old registrants. So there are no duplicates, so to speak. And we do find duplicates. If you do manual fingerprinting, it's not perfect. And the people who do cross-checking cannot use all of your manual fingerprints cross-checking. Some are not good enough to be used for cross-checking.
Mhm.
And so that's a weakness in the system because it can allow persons who are not eligible in because you couldn't eliminate them in the cross-checking exercise.
Mhm.
That's one. But secondly, when you do digital fingerprinting, you're able, as I said, to perfect the cross-checking base because all of the digital fingerprints are usable in cross-checking. Because when you're doing digital fingerprints, the system rejects a fingerprint that is not good. You know? Anybody who's traveled, if you go to America and you don't put your hand down properly when they're checking your fingerprint, they don't accept it. And it's the same thing that would occur. That if your fingerprint is not good, the digital system will reject it. So we only end up with a reservoir of good cross-checkable fingerprints.
Mhm.
So it starts to eliminate the possibility of duplicates in your registration system. But it goes beyond that. It also can be used at the place of poll, where these fingerprints which are captured at registration are in a system which you have to place your fingers on for verification of the authenticity of your print.
That's when you present yourself to vote.
To vote, vis-a-vis the name on the list. And if it is not the right person, the system rejects the person based on a mismatch of fingerprints. And so that is a mechanism that will allow for persons who attempt to vote for others to be rejected. And therefore, the concern that one has about, quote unquote, the bloated list can be relatively mitigated, because the concern really is about people using the bloated list to have fraudulent votes cast. And biometrics are likely to eliminate the extent, the totality, the extent of those fraudulent attempts. And therefore, even though you may have a list that represents a number larger than your population, biometrics brings you down to the right number in terms of those who are eligible to vote, because it eliminates in the process persons who are not eligible to cast a particular vote from being able to cast them.
The fallout from that is, statistically, you will get a low voter turnout at the end in your report.
Well, you may get a real,
because
I won't call it a low voter turnout, you get a real
voter turnout, because we've had voter turnouts in some part of Guyana's hinterland that exceed 100%.
You'll get the real voter turnout.
Yeah.
That is what you'll get, the real voter turnout, because it will reflect the real voters and will not have allowed in the persons who are not the real voters. Now, the nexus between that and this money story, this money story, if you have a biometric mechanism, then you can even use that in the process of distributing the cash, so that you have a system where only eligible persons are able to draw, because only persons who are authentic and on your register and identified by their fingerprints will be able to present themselves and to collect the money.
And
so it's a measure that can serve a purpose other than elections.
And there will be an immediate record made, an entry made, that this person has checked in, has collected.
Yes, definitely.
And the accountability process.
It will also
aid
the accountability.
And so the process becomes transparent in its entirety.
Definitely.
So tell us now where you are at GECOM in this conversation regarding biometrics.
Well, I would say where we are at GECOM is attempting to move from stagnation to slothfulness. That's where we are. We have agreed to have discussions, and the document has been prepared for discussions in relation to biometrics, both in terms of digital capture of fingerprints and in terms of the use of the fingerprints for identification purposes at the place of poll. But we have had postponements and pushbacks on that discussion. I am now advised that that discussion, which was scheduled for last week, will now take place this week. It disappeared mysteriously off of the agenda last week, and it's we've been given a guarantee it's up for discussion this week.
What was your perspective on the PPP identified commissioner's disposition to this whole business of biometrics?
There has been an attempt to throw into the works a spanner which says that biometrics may interfere with people's right to vote and be in conflict with the ruling that talked about the identification cards in 1997. And so there's a pushback from that perspective on biometrics.
Assuming but not admitting that to be true, having not explored it in its entirety, isn't the cure for that amendment to the legislation or a move to get the constitution reviewed and amended in that particular context?
Well, first of all, I would say this. The argument is tremendously flawed. The issue about a voter ID was an issue which says, look, once a button is in the register, you should allow that person to vote and not restrict that person based on some document called a voter ID.
Mm.
The fact of the matter is that we use an ID card as a voter ID.
Yep.
And we use an affidavit of oath
In the
in
absence.
of voter ID.
Mm.
So we do use a mechanism that says you have to be who you are. And that mechanism is an ID card. It's not biometrics, so people can misuse the ID card, as has proven to be the case, or an affidavit, and that too could be misused. The very idea of an affidavit suggests that people could do something untowards.
And there's evidence that that has been done
Right.
in the past.
Now, if the fundamental issue still is being able to authenticate the voter, and we're using those mechanisms, both of those mechanisms are less venerable, less usable than a digital identification.
But is there not existing at the moment partial biometrics? Because when I was
We have
registered,
biometrics, it's not digital.
yeah, but hold on. You're using those prints, my prints,
Yes.
to verify, to cross-check, to
Right.
establish that this is Mervyn Williams. And therefore, this is the person registered by that name to vote. Now, if you digitize those very prints, how different it is?
No,
Is it from, having?
that's where the problem is.
Mm.
I mentioned earlier that manual fingerprints are problematic. It is not, you're not going to get the quality of, you're not going to get the quality if you try to digitize manual fingerprints. They in themselves, some of them are not usable for the purpose of cross-matching. And when you try to digitize, then you may amplify the problem. And that is why you need the process where you take the prints digitally and then use them digitally for identification purposes.
Right. And you,
But the concept of biometrics is already embedded in the system because you are, in fact, doing a biometric when you take a manual print. And therefore, this contention that having people take prints digitally may have some constitutional,
it's far-fetched
it's balderdash, because all you do is using a different technology
to do the
You're
same
not
thing.
to do this thing which the law already provides for.
But where is the political will? If that contention, let's just for conversation in another 3 minutes or so, if the contention of the PPP representatives and the commission, just for conversational purposes, were to be held as the position, where is the collective political will of those same representatives to say, okay, here's a problem, here's a solution. Let's move to the legislative arm of government and fix this problem.
I don't think they care to have the matter resolved. It's a question of interest. One of the problems we have in GECOM is that when you raise a matter and say, look, this is not within the purview of GECOM to rectify, but the extent to which the Constitution gives us a responsibility for the conduct of free and fair elections, is the extent to which if we think there are flaws in the system, we should be making recommendations to the legislature for rectification. It's the extent to which GECOM says that's a legislature's business.
But you
And
also,
they are shy.
but you also have the prerogative of making your own rules.
Yes, but there's
If there's something above that, then you make the recommendation upwards.
what I'm saying, GECOM has not exhibited the will or the commitment to make those recommendations.
And that appears to be rather convenient, I may
It
say.
doesn't appear to be. It is rather convenient because it seems to represent a maintenance of a system which people have an interest in, and a non-committal lack of commitment to do anything that would change that flawed system.
In a minute or a minute and a half, what is your anticipation regarding this conversation going forward as it relates to elections which are on the horizon and could possibly be called even before its constitutional date?
There will be pushback on the biometric aspect from a number of perspectives. I mentioned one already.
Mm-hmm.
You might have another one called cost, might have another one called time in relation to the upcoming elections. At the end of the day, I think that this matter has to be resolved based on the will of the people. People have to manifest the demand for the change, and the people should not acquiesce to any election that is not conducted after these things are implemented.
On that note, the People's National Congress Reform continues to hold its weekly demonstration in front of the Guyana Elections Commission on Tuesdays. And if Guyanese believe, as I know we all do, that there's need for clean voters list and biometrics at the place of poll to guarantee us credible elections, free and fair elections, elections that are democratic and acceptable, and for which the results will be acceptable to all. Join us in front of the Guyana Elections Commission this and every Tuesday as we appeal for a clean voters list and biometrics at the place of poll. Mr. Alexander, thank you very much for joining me again on Nation Watch and making clear all the issues that you have. I know that there are other areas that we can delve into, except that we are completely out of time. To our viewers, thank you for joining us and staying the course of the program. From wherever you're watching, from wherever you're listening, God bless until we meet again next Sunday.